Welcome back. We've learnt the Cobb-Douglas production function, but what economic theory is it based on? In this lesson, we'll learn the evolution of theories of economic growth from the classical theory to the neoclassical theory and on to the endogenous growth theory. We shall also discuss various convergence hypotheses that developing economies will eventually reach the standard of living of developed countries. A lot to cover, so let's get rolling. Before we begin, I wish to clarify that it is very difficult and time-consuming to fully learn and understand the various theories, so my suggestion is you don't spend too much time understanding the intricacies. Rather, the learning outcome is to merely compare the three theories, so our focus is really to simplify models to highlight the key differences between them. As such, some details may not be covered, so the information here may not be entirely complete. If you have the time, you can read the curriculum text for the details. Let's first revise the production function, which states that the output of an economy is a function of the capital and labour input multiplied by the total factor productivity, which is a proxy for the level of technology. The classical model is based on Malthusian economics, which is focused on the impact of a growing population in a world with limited resources. The key assumption underlying the classical model is that when the level of per capita income rises above the subsistence income, which is the minimum income needed to maintain life, population growth accelerates. Population growth leads to diminishing marginal returns to labour, which reduces productivity and drives GDP per capita back to the subsistence level. This mechanism would prevent long-term growth in per capita GDP. In other words, increasing capital and technology results in a larger population, but the increase in output does not result in a richer population on a per capita basis. This theory was developed in 1798. Today, we can clearly argue that this theory does not generally hold, as many countries have achieved growth in per capita income on a long-term basis. This model has failed for two reasons. Firstly, the assumption that population growth accelerates when per capita income increases did not materialize. In fact, as the growth of per capita income increased, population growth slowed, as evident in many developed markets like Japan and Europe. Secondly, technological progress can be rapid enough to more than offset the impact of diminishing marginal returns, resulting in income per capita growth. This is evident in most developing and developed countries. So, as the classical model's pessimistic prediction never materialized, economists changed the focus of the analysis away from labour to capital and to the neoclassical model. The heart of the neoclassical growth theory is the Cobb-Douglas production function, where the potential output of the economy is given as the function of the labour input, available capital, and the total factor productivity. Alpha is the share of GDP allocated to capital. The primary focus of the neoclassical model is to determine the economy's long-term steady-state growth rate, also known as the sustainable growth rate. Remember these two words, steady state, which we'll revisit later as this is the central theme of neoclassical theory. We've learned in the first lesson that when expressed on a per-unit labour basis, the output per worker or labour productivity is as such. We also learnt the principles of diminishing marginal productivity, where the effect of capital deepening on labour productivity diminishes further up the curve. Developed markets tend to already be at a high capital to labour ratio, so increasing the amount of capital investments may do little to increase labour productivity. Contrast that to developing markets which operate at a much lower capital to labour ratio. For the same amount of capital deepening, the increase in labour productivity is much higher. This is how the neoclassical model reasons why GDP growth rates in developing nations are significantly higher than that of developed nations. Regardless, all markets will eventually get to a point where profit-maximizing producers will stop adding capital. This point is very significant in the neoclassical model of growth, where per capita growth in the economy will come to a halt. This is the equilibrium point where the marginal product of capital and the marginal cost of capital are equal. Producers will not want to borrow at a higher cost to produce less than that cost. This is known as the steady state of the economy, where it becomes unsustainable to increase productivity through continued capital deepening. Rather, growth in labour productivity is sustainably achieved through technological advancements. This sustainable growth rate is the growth rate in technology divided by labour's share of GDP. The sustainable growth rate of output, denoted by capital G star, is the sustainable growth rate of output per capita plus the growth of labour. Let's pause for some practice. An economist wishes to forecast the steady-state growth rate of two developed countries based on neoclassical theory. She made the following estimates. Based on these estimates, determine the sustainable growth rates for the two countries. Pause the video now and work out your answer. And we're back. If you can recall the formula for sustainable growth rate based on neoclassical theory, this should be quite straightforward. Plug in the figures for country A, and we get a growth rate of 2.5%. Likewise, for country B, we get 2.4%. From this example, we can see that the sustainable growth rates for the two countries are comparable. However, growth for country A is sustained by higher growth in technology and the smaller share of labour in the economy. In contrast, the growth in country B is mainly driven by growth in the labour force. Based on the neoclassical model, we can make a number of important conclusions regarding economic growth. Firstly, an economy's growth rate will move towards its steady state regardless of the initial capital to labour ratio or level of technology. In the steady state, the growth rate in productivity is a function only of the growth rate of technology and labour's share of total output. Capital deepening can only affect the level of output, but not the growth rate in the long run. Second, long-term sustainable growth cannot rely solely on capital deepening investment. Because of diminishing marginal returns to capital, the only way to sustain growth in productivity is through technological advancement. This results in an upward shift in the production function. And third, given that developing countries start at a lower capital to labour ratio than developed countries, the growth rates of developing countries should exceed those of developed countries. As a result, the neoclassical model predicts that there should be a convergence of per capita incomes between developed and developing countries over time. We'll discuss more about this convergence at the end of this lesson. And lastly, this is not very obvious and is difficult to explain. In essence, you need to remember that the model predicts an increase in savings or investments will only temporarily raise economic growth. Once an economy achieves steady-state growth, the growth rate does not depend on the percentage of income saved or invested. Higher savings cannot permanently raise the growth rate of output. However, countries with higher savings rates will have a higher level of per capita output and labour productivity and a higher capital to labour ratio. One major shortcoming of the neoclassical model is that it does not explicitly explain the economic determinants of technological progress or how TFP changes over time. Because technology is determined outside the model, critics argue that the neoclassical model ignores the very factor driving growth in advanced economies. In contrast, the endogenous growth theory focuses on explaining technological progress within the model rather than treating it as exogenous. Under this theory, investment in capital can affect a permanent increase in the rate of growth. This is because the definition of capital is broadened to include items such as human or knowledge capital and research and development. Increasing R&D investments, for example, results in benefits not only for the firm making the R&D investments, but can potentially raise the level of productivity for the entire economy. This is known as the societal effect. Therefore, the total factor productivity of the economy is raised and growth rate is permanently increased. Due to the perceived benefits of R&D investments on the society as a whole, many governments subsidize R&D investments in the private sector. With government support, private companies may be more inclined to undertake expensive R&D projects, which may otherwise be deemed unprofitable for the firm. In comparison, the neoclassical theory predicts increase in savings or investments will only temporarily raise the economic growth rate. Besides, neoclassical theory assumes that sustainable growth comes from increases in TFP not related to the investment in capital within the model. Endogenous growth theory, on the other hand, assumes that capital investment in human capital and R&D may actually improve total factor productivity due to the societal effect. In conclusion, let us summarize the key differences between the three economic growth theories. The classical growth theory predicts that in the long term, per capita GDP or income growth is zero. This also means that growth in real GDP is merely in line with population growth. This is because of the assumption that if per capita income grows, population growth will accelerate, causing the per capita income to drop back to the subsistence level. This demonstrates the diminishing marginal effect of labour. In comparison, neoclassical growth theory predicts that growth rates will converge to a steady state based on the growth in technology, labour's share of GDP, and the labour growth rate. Unlike classical theory, the model makes no assumption on the population growth. Technology growth is seen as the key to sustainable productivity growth in the steady state. Increasing savings rate and capital investments may only temporarily increase growth rate. At steady state, growth does not depend on savings rate and capital investments. The key assumption for neoclassical is the diminishing marginal effect of capital. Endogenous growth theory predicts that economies may not reach the steady-state growth that the neoclassical model predicts. Rather, growth may permanently increase through investments in human capital and R&D, or through increase in savings rate. Unlike the other two theories, the endogenous model makes no assumption regarding diminishing marginal effect of labour or capital. And lastly, let's talk about convergence. We've learned that the neoclassical growth theory predicts that developing markets experience higher growth rates than developed markets, so the standard of living for less developed countries will eventually converge to the levels of developed countries. Specifically, neoclassical theory predicts two types of convergence: absolute convergence and conditional convergence. Absolute convergence suggests that less developed countries, regardless of their particular characteristics, will eventually catch up with the developed countries and match them in per capita output. The neoclassical model assumes that all countries have access to the same technology, so eventually all countries will reach the same steady state with the same sustainable per capita growth rate. Thus, the model implies convergence of per capita growth rates among all countries. However, the shortcoming of this hypothesis is that not all countries have the same underlying characteristics in terms of savings rate and population growth rate. That brings us to conditional convergence, which hypothesizes that convergence is conditional on the countries having the same savings rate, population growth rate, and production function. So, for example, if there are countries with lower savings rate, their per capita output and sustainable growth rates may not be able to converge with the developed nations. However, this still does not explain why there are some countries with similar characteristics that are lagging behind in growth and do not seem to be on the path of convergence to developed nations. An additional hypothesis is club convergence, which can help to explain this. Under this hypothesis, countries may be part of a club, which may refer to countries with similar institutional features such as savings rates, financial markets, property rights, health and educational services. Under club convergence, poorer countries that are part of the club will grow rapidly to catch up with their richer peers. Other countries can also join the club by making appropriate institutional changes. Those countries that are not part of the club may never achieve the higher standard of living. And phew, that's our overview and comparison of the theories of growth. As mentioned at the beginning, focus on the key differences between the various theories and try not to get bogged down with the details. In our next lesson, we wrap up this topic by learning the impact that opening up an economy can have on its economic growth. See you again.